like dogs in the hope that they will leave. And ever since then, the U.S.-Israeli practice has followed the advice of one of the leaders who was actually most sympathetic to the Palestinian plight. Well, none of this breaks new ground. These are familiar elements of domination and repression. Humiliation and degradation are at their core. Comes second nature to anyone with their boot on someone's neck. It's well known to anyone who's studied the history of imperialism and conquest, and it's not at all surprising that the United States and Israel should now be infuriated by their loss of a monopoly of violence and terror, though by virtue of their power they remain well in the lead. Well, the official justification for the perpetuation of many years of repression and terror is that the Palestinians rejected the magnanimous and generous offer of Clinton and Barak at Camp David in the year 2000, so they deserve their fate. And there's a simple way to evaluate that claim, very simple. Have a look at a map, okay? Unfortunately, it's a difficult task to carry out because none were published, which is interesting. It's not that it's hard to publish map. You want to know if the offer was magnanimous? Take a look at the map. That'll tell you. It's easy enough. I mean, they were published in Israel, in the Israeli press. They were published in marginal publications here. And unless there's something to conceal, they would have appeared regularly on the front pages here, along with the chorus of self-praise about our magnanimity. And a look at the maps reveals very quickly why they did not appear. It is true that the Clinton-Barak offers registered some progress. At the time of the negotiations, Palestinians in the West Bank were confined to over 200 isolated cantons, and the magnanimous offer reduced it to 4. Therefore, it approached from below, remember, it approached from below the moral level of South Africa in the depths of apartheid 40 years ago, when the first Bantustans were established. Bush and Powell have regressed even below that. They are offering no more than a vision of what South Africa actually implemented 40 years ago. There's also been no change in the intentions, which are openly announced, described by Barak's chief negotiator at Camp David, Shlomo Ben-Ami, one of the architects of the Camp David Accords and a dove in the Israeli spectrum. He explained, just before joining the government in 1998, he explained the intention of the Oslo process, namely to create a neo-colonial dependency for the Palestinians in the occupied territories with permanent dependence on Israel, meaning the U.S.-Israel alliance. So Bantustans. And the analysis is correct, and it should have also made headlines right along with the unpublished maps and along with the actions which were taken at the time to drive the point home. The final Clinton-Barak year, in that year, settlement programs expanded to their highest peak since 1992, pre-Oslo, under Sharon. Well, you take a look at history, it again reveals the continuity of policy. So right now there's a great deal of interest in the Saudi peace plan, which was adopted by the Arab League in March. And this is regularly described here as a historic opportunity if only the Arab states will at last accept the existence of Israel, as in fact they have repeatedly done, along with the PLO, since January 1976, when they joined the rest of the world in backing a Security Council resolution which called for a political settlement based on Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories with, I'm quoting it, appropriate arrangements to guarantee the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of all states in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized borders. So that's in effect UN 242, the basic document, amplified to include a Palestinian state. As usual, the resolution was vetoed by the United States, which is a double veto. It vetoes it from history. Similar initiatives have regularly been blocked by Washington right to the present. A majority of Americans also support the political settlement that is now reiterated in the Saudi plan, but unless they undertake a research project, Americans cannot know that the primary barrier to the diplomatic settlement that they support happens to be the Washington-Israel alliance, as it's been for 25 years, actually longer if we look closely. Well, unless this changes, and that means changes right here, the prospects there are for descent into even more bitter tribal warfare with ominous consequences that are likely to spread well beyond. Well, finally, looking back over quickly, very quickly, over a longer stretch, at the end of World War II, the United States had a position of global wealth and power that had no analog in human history. With the reconstruction of other industrial societies, the U.S. share of global wealth declined from about half after the Second World War to about a quarter by the 1970s. That's the time when the major critical change in post-war policy took place, namely the post-war economic system was dismantled and the current neoliberal framework was established. It's been accompanied for the past 25 years by deterioration in major macroeconomic indices, apart from countries that didn't follow the rules, and a notable attack on the substance of democracy. These are important topics, but I can't go into them now. Well, by the 1970s, the world had become economically tripolar with roughly comparable centers in North America, Europe, and East Asia, but it was militarily bipolar, U.S. and Russia. And each of the superpowers imposed constraints on the other. And the Cold War conflicts, which were, of course, violent and destructive, were within the domains of the superpowers. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world became unipolar militarily, remaining tripolar economically as it is now. A couple of years ago, Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote in the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, that much of the world, he seemed to imply most of the world, considered the United States to be a rogue state, the greatest threat to their existence, possibly a reasonable estimate, and possibly more so today. It can also be reasonably argued, I think, that the evolving system of state corporate power is a threat to its own, based in Washington, it's a threat to its own population, us. The tendencies that lead in that direction are very real, they're not inexorable, and there are others that strongly counter them. Well, if you look over the centuries, there's been significant expansion in the realm of freedom and justice. There are periods of regression, but the cycle is generally upward. As always, human affairs are scarcely predictable. Very little is understood, and too much depends on will and choice. The emerging framework of world power should not be an object of detached contemplation, but has to be forged by dedicated work and struggle, always based on an effort to dismantle doctrinal constraints, to see what's before our eyes, which is not really very deeply hidden.
Thank you, Professor. Never really gets to the point, always talks around the subject. You notice that? We have just a short period of time for questions. We have two microphones here, and given the hour, I'll ask if you have a question, to be brief, to get to the point. I think we should probably just, I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask, but I get to do that every day, so why don't I give you guys an opportunity, starting down here.
Hi. Could you talk about the U.S. participation in the recent coup against the Venezuelan president, including
U.S. participation in the coup against the Venezuelan president?
Including the active involvement of Otto Reich and Elliot Abrams back from the Reagan years, and also about the removal of the Brazilian ambassador to the Organization Against the Proliferation of Chemical Weapons.
Let's take one, if we can.
Okay.
couldn't hear
All right.
most of it. As far as Venezuela is concerned, I mean, I don't know any more than you do, just what was in the newspapers. Everyone was expecting, for years, everybody's been expecting a military coup in Venezuela, kind of like the coup in Chile. The only question is when. That there have been plans for it, I don't think we can seriously doubt. When the military coup took place, it was immediately welcomed in Washington. All the and in the editorials and everywhere else, a wonderful thing. However, something very surprising happened. There was an upsurge. There was a popular upsurge, and the generals and the president they'd imposed had to back off. Meanwhile, the Latin American countries had condemned the coup. I think Canada went along with the United States, if I'm not mistaken. But the Latin American countries went along, opposed the coup on grounds that it was unconstitutional, an attack on democracy. They don't like Chavez, but they were in favor of democracy. However, the northern democracies, and certainly the United States, and I think Canada, thought that the overthrow of democracy was just fine. And then when it was restored, they were kind of embarrassed. And then comes the cover-up, in which you read that the United States was secretly telling the generals, this is not nice and you have to follow constitutional procedures, but so secretly that you can't find any record of it. Well, you can make of that what you like. The U.S. is embarrassed by its open opposition to democracy in comparison with Latin America. And it has to cover up, and there'll be a cover-up. But my suspicion, like everyone else's, is there'll be another coup, unless Chavez is really tamed, unless he's willing to follow U.S. orders.
Okay, over here.
Hi, Professor Chomsky, Oren Weinrip. Two questions, and I'm actually more interested in the second if you choose to answer only one. The first raises just the issue of, I did take a look at the maps. I'm sympathetic to most of what you say, but I'm just curious. I read a long analysis by Shlomo Ben-Ami of the talks, and it seems that by the point they reached Taba, there was, with exchange of territories and something between 97% to 100% with compensation on the table. And Ben-Ami's complaint there was that Arafat refused to come back with a counter proposal.
Well, there's one problem with it. Yeah, I read the same things. First of all, remember that Taba is 6 months after Camp David. Mm-hmm. It was January 2001. It was informal discussions. And what happened to the Taba, we can talk about what the Taba agreements were, and we know a lot about them because there's a report by the European observer, Moratinos, approved by both sides, which describes in detail what they were talking about, so I can go into that if you like. But it's kind of academic because they were called off not by Arafat, but by Barak. Okay, Barak called them off. Okay, so there were informal meetings in Taba, which did make some progress beyond Camp David, but if you take a look, the major issues were still there. You're Israeli?
My mother is.
Okay, but you know this business, the country and that sort of thing. Okay, well, the main issue was what happens to that big salient east of Jerusalem that breaks the West Bank into two and includes the city of Ma'ale Adumim, which was established by primarily the Labor Party and Clinton in order to bisect the West Bank. And they were still divided over that, one of several issues. And the exchanges of territory were meaningless. It was pieces of the desert. However, I agree with the point. I mean, there was progress in the informal meetings in Taba, though there were huge problems, and they might have gotten somewhere if Barak hadn't called them off.
Okay, and
would you forgive me if I move to another microphone? There are a number of people, and I'm not sure that we'll even get to the people who've taken the time to line up.
Thanks.
All right.
Hi. Consistent with U.S. foreign policy, there seems to be a two-faced policy in regards to China. On the one hand, we're becoming closer and closer to them as a trading partner, and on the other hand, we're beginning to demonize them as our next great superpower to build up our arms race against. I'd like to hear what you have to say on that subject.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, policy towards China is kind of ambivalent. They're a major a region for investment and trade. As China moves into the World Trade Organization, the West hopes that it's going to subordinate itself to Western investors, kind of like Mexico. which would be a huge boon to U.S. agricultural exporters, to financial institutions which expect to take over the Chinese direction of the Chinese economy. This is probably going to wipe out about a couple 100 million Chinese peasants. Nobody knows what will happen to them. So that's the upside. On the other hand, the downside is that they remain a nationalist country, which, with their own concerns and might pursue their own objectives, they're not going to invade anybody, but it's a powerful force that might be part of an independent Asia. China and Japan together, especially Japan and its surroundings, but now also China, in principle could be the dominant economic force in the world. They probably have the largest financial reserves in the world right now. And they're not a military force, but that can change. So yeah, that's a concern. Just like there's a concern over Europe going its own way. So it's mixed.
Okay.
Pretty much like you said.
Thank you. Back to this mic.
Hi. Some commentators say that we...
Can you get a little closer to the mic, please? Thank you.
Hi, Professor. Some commentators say that we have to wait for a new generation of leaders in Israel to even begin to achieve peace. Even with a new generation of leaders, do you believe it's possible to even achieve peace within the Middle East? Could you comment on that?
Do I agree? No, I think the main problem is right here. I think the main problem is right here. It's very easy to blame other people for the terrible things they do, right? So you can look at all these bad people in the world and they're doing all kind of awful things. In fact, there's a new literary genre that's developing, which is very widely hailed in the United States. You can read, laudatory reviews in all the main papers. It's about, it's a series of books, one by the head of the Human Rights Center at Harvard, which do talk about a flaw in the American character and therefore are extremely courageous. The flaw is that we somehow don't respond properly to the crimes of others. Okay, you take a look at those books and the laudatory reviews and the indices and so on, you notice there's a slight gap. How do we respond to our own crimes? Well, that you can't ask. Okay, so you can go as far as saying, well, we don't respond properly to the crimes of others, and that's an enormous act of courage, and we laud it, and so on. But what about the vastly more important question about ourselves? And the same is true here. There will not be, there's conflicting groups inside Israel right now, and there will be in the future. But those who want to move towards a peaceful accommodation are not going to get anywhere unless they have support in the United States. And so far, the United States has, for 25 years, insisted on blocking peace. Remember, the Saudi peace plan, in essence, was proposed at the Security Council 25 years ago, blocked by the United States. The U.S. vetoed the similar plan again in 1980. It blocked, along with Israel, blocked similar Saudi plan in 1981. Right through the 1980s, it was blocking PLO and Arab state and European initiatives more or less of the same type. You take a look at the General Assembly records where there's no technical veto. Year after year, from the mid-70s up till the 90s, there are regular votes every December session on similar proposals with numbers like, 150 to 2, U.S. and Israel. Sometimes they pick up Dominica or something like Micronesia. But that's what's been going on. There's great praise for Baker, who was very forthcoming, Secretary of State for George Bush. You can read it in the Christian Science Monitor this morning, big review of the so-called peace process, lauding Baker for really going very far. The only thing it doesn't mention, and is never mentioned, is the Baker Plan. That is the official U.S. policy in December 1989, called the Baker Plan. You can read it in the State Department bulletin, which endorsed, I'll tell you what it said, it endorsed the coalition position of the Israeli government, that's Shamir and Peres, their position, which has never been published in the United States except in the dissident literature, but it is the Baker Plan. Their position says, first, there cannot be an additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. What does additional mean? Well, it means there already is a Palestinian state, namely Jordan, and there can't be an additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. Second, The status of the occupied territories called Judea, Samaria, and Gaza will be determined according to the guidelines established by the Israeli government. That's point 2. Point 3 is we will allow free elections under Israeli military rule, and though they didn't mention it, with tens of thousands of Palestinian intellectuals in jail. Well, that last point did get some mention here, showing how forthcoming we are and how much we love democracy. But the first two, didn't describe it the way I just did. You know, I said free elections, isn't that wonderful? But that's the Baker Plan, which is now being lauded as tremendously forthcoming. In fact, there just isn't an exception. You take a look at the whole record. It's a formal. These are not secrets. You know, you don't have to go to declassified records for these. It's all public material. There's simply no deviation from that position. I mean, on paper there is. Like you can read Jimmy Carter in the New York Times a couple of days ago saying, yeah, we all agreed. In fact, he even says Begin agreed on Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories in 1978. I mean, if he believes that, you just have to have pity on him. What Begin said in 1978 is we're not going to withdraw from the occupied territories, we're going to settle them. You want to pay for it, that's fine. And Carter did. In fact, U.S. aid to Israel went up to half of total U.S. aid. Now, maybe Carter believes he heard Begin say, I'm going to withdraw, but he certainly didn't say it, and he certainly didn't act on it. Now, until that changes, there will be no opportunity for political leadership to develop in Israel that will try to implement these approaches.
Thank you. And back here.
Professor, I think you've done a marvelous job of deconstructing American foreign policy and a lot of the myths that are used to rationalize it. I wonder if you could talk some more about where we go from here, where the Israelis go from here, where the Palestinians go from here.
Oh, can we just pick one?
I just talk about us. I mean,
let's talk
Israelis
about-
and
let's talk about
Palestinians,
the
that's
United
up to
States.
Well,
them.
I think,
Yeah.
if I can just make a brief comment, I think you would find that in all those constituencies, a vast majority of the population, out of fear, in some cases very justified, feels that all the actions are justified in terms of self-defense, which 9/11 sort of underscores for most Americans.
Well, I'm not interested in giving lectures to Palestinians and Israelis. I mean, when I'm in Tel Aviv or when I'm in Birzeit, I tell them what I think they should do, but I'm here, okay? So I think we should ask what we should do. What we should do is very straightforward and simple and within our reach. First of all, break through the doctrinal constraints, which are rigid, and find out what's going on, okay? Once you find out what's going on, well, you maybe agree that I'm right or you may think I'm wrong, but whatever it'll be, you'll at least know what's going on when you look at the maps and so on. And if what I said turns out to be more or less accurate, it's clear what we ought to do. We ought to change U.S. policy so that it no longer is the major impediment to peace in the region. And that's, it's a pretty conservative view. You know, it means taking the position of the majority of the American population and even the formal position of the U.S. government and saying, okay, let's do it. And we know how to do it. Israel will respond to what the U.S. says. They have to, they have no choice. And they always do when the push comes to shove. If there's any resistance, you just make a hint that maybe we'll suspend arms shipments for a little while. But there's no real need. If the U.S. agrees to accept the long-standing international consensus on this and the position of its own population, yeah, you can move towards the kind of settlement that everyone more or less agrees is the only short-term possibility. Some kind of two-state settlement on the internationally recognized borders with all the wording that I just repeated from the 1976 declaration that comes from UN 242, the rights of both states in the region to peace and security and so on and so forth. The Palestinian state would certainly be disarmed. There could be some border adjustment, mutual adjustments. There might be some territorial trading. These are all technicalities. The main thing is to agree to the general point that there can be a viable Palestinian state. Unless that's agreed to, there won't be any progress, and the U.S. has so far totally refused that.
Well, over here.
Good evening, Professor Chomsky. Are you familiar with House of Representative Cynthia McKinney, Democrat from Georgia, her allegations that certain segments of government knew in advance about the terrorist bombing and that the Bush family in particular were in cahoots with a so-called bin Laden construction company?
Well, Cynthia McKinney's a great person, and I'm glad she's in Congress. She didn't actually make those allegations the way I read it. She raised some questions, and I think myself the questions are off the wall. I don't think there's any conceivable possibility that this was known in advance by U.S. intelligence. However, the second part is not even dubious. The Bush family and those around them were certainly involved with the bin Laden family in all kind of projects. In fact, Dick Cheney, a lot of his money comes from dealings through various, intricate offshore groups and so on, dealings that get Iranian and Iraqi oil to the United States. And yeah, the family, there's all kinds of intricate involvements there, which would quickly be discovered if anybody looked for them. On the other hand, that's separate from the allegations about involvement in the, say, World Trade Center bombing. That just doesn't make any sense, in my opinion.
Over here, microphone number 1.
National IDs are in the works. Medical history is open to anyone, especially law enforcement, without your signature and knowledge. Censorship, cameras everywhere, a shadow government, Cheney in hiding, and now last Friday, a standing armed military at the ready on U.S. soil illegally against our Constitution, according to Jim Lear of the PBS NewsHour. Now, my question is this. What will it be used against? Will it be U.S. citizens? And just exactly why do we need a standing armed military on our soil? And also, how do we as citizens of the United States fight despotism? I know our vote is important, but what if our vote is compromised as in Florida? I see the above list headed toward despotism. How do we as a people depose the despot?
Let's take the first part of the question.
I'm
if we can.
much less alarmed about any of that, to tell you the truth. I think, first of all, about the last election, yes, there were Florida shenanigans and so on, but the fact of the matter is that a much bigger factor in the Florida vote than all of the shenanigans was the fact that under Clinton and Gore, so many black males had been put in jail and disenfranchised that alone swung the vote. Would have easily swung the vote to the Democrats. And I tend to agree with the large majority of the American population that this is not a big issue. Florida vote has been a huge issue among intellectuals, very interested in it. Lots of articles about, this, that, and the other thing that went wrong. And they've been kind of intrigued that it's been commented on that most of the population seems to think it's a bore. And I basically agree with them. The problem with the election was not that. It was other things. I mean, the major issues that concern the population never even came up in the election. Literally never came up because the population was opposed to elites on them. Right before the election, like on the eve of the election, about 75% of the population regarded it as a joke. Some kind of game among rich people and party bosses and the public relations industry. So therefore, they're not much interested if, the Supreme Court made some crazy decision to switch it one way or another over in what was pretty near a statistical tie. So whatever was going on there was serious, but I think we're looking at the wrong problem. There was a problem, but it was not the stealing of the votes. On the military part, look, the civil libertarian tradition in the United States is by now quite strong. There were times, and not in the very recent past, when the government was able to carry out highly repressive and brutal actions. I don't think that's possible anymore. There's just been too many victories, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, which have established barriers to government repression. We face plenty of problems, but in my view, at least, that's one of the least of them.